to an outside observer, to an extreme unexpert like myself, it seems like the strategy is, instead of try to de-escalate a street fight, if you're going to compare the nuclear arms race to getting in a street fight in Brooklyn or something, it's like the strategy would be to punch the guy in the face at the same time he punches you in the face. And so you're both lying on the floor, knocked out, possibly brain damage, head bounces off the concrete, rather than build the skills to, you know, be like, hey, whoa, like we could both knock each other out, but you know, it doesn't, we don't have to constantly be threatening other people with it.
Yeah. So, so really the idea isn't so much that I'm trying to punch, we're going to punch each other at the same time. It's that I'm threatening to punch you and you're threatening to punch me. And I'm saying like, don't try to take my wallet or I'll punch you. And then that gets out of hand. So like nuclear weapons first came about, end of the Second World War. Around then, late 40s, the Manhattan Project, pretty famous. A bunch of US, Canadian, British scientists got together, figured out how to make a nuclear weapon work. And then they built a couple, but back then the fissile nuclear material, so uranium, plutonium, that stuff was super rare at the time, and they thought it was going to stay very rare. And so early on, the U.S. thought they were the only ones who would ever have nuclear weapons. And it's like 2 or 4 years later, then the Russians tested their own. So, it spread much quicker than people thought. So it wasn't until like I think it's like the 50s and the 60s that this idea, now we call it deterrence, but this idea that you threaten each other with your nuclear weapons as a way to sort of prevent each other from attacking. The problem with that is that if you get into this mindset, well, it's like, well, I just got to punch them harder, or I got to punch them first. Then that pushes you to build more and more weapons so you can attack them first. And, one of the ideas is that you try to destroy the other side's weapons in an attack. And so to do that, you just need a lot more weapons. And then the other side is sitting there like, wow, they're building up all these weapons. I got to build more in response so that they can't disarm me or that I can disarm them. And that's what led to the arms race of the Cold War. So I think by like the 60s, there were like 60,000 nuclear weapons, mostly between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at that time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until like after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was one of like the big close calls, or relatively early on, or in the middle of the Cold War, that the U.S. and Soviets were like, this is kind of getting out of hand. Nuclear war doesn't really benefit either of those two sides. Like, they try to use it to their advantage to do this like coercion to like jockey for place, but actually getting into a nuclear war is just bad for everyone. So it was around then that they started trying to put guardrails on things and start cutting down on the number of weapons they had. And that's what arms control is.
What was the communication like at the time of the Cold War between scientists that are studying nuclear weapons and nuclear policy, and then the actual policymakers and military officials? Because it's looking at the arms race, just seeing the explosive power and how a lot of it seems like emotional. It seems like if a leader was making decisions based off of pure emotions and not logic and trying to de-escalate, like if you put a teenage girl in charge of a country, and then there were a bunch of other teenagers in charge of other countries, they would say, let's build up our shit as big as possible and try to blow each other up. Like that, it seems like such a emotional, immature response. And I'm not sure I would do any better. I probably wouldn't if I was in that position, because it's hard to get out of a mindset if everyone else is trapped in it. But what was the communication style or system between scientists and between the people making decisions that affect nuclear policy?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost more of a teenage boy kind of
teenage boy, yeah, teenager, like yeah, exactly, yeah. The teenage girl would be spreading the rumors behind the backs of the leaders and trying to incite them to fight themselves, and the teenage boy would be more of, I'm going to engage you physically and blow you up directly.
So like the early on, a lot of the thinking around nuclear weapons and how to use them. So keep in mind, like nuclear weapons came out, they got used end of the Second World War, and then they were still kind of figuring out how to best use them. So early on in like the 50s, they were still thinking about, how can I use nuclear weapons as just another kind of weapon? So I think there was a lot of thinking going on around potentially using them in the Korean War at some point, but it eventually got shut down.